Have you ever wondered why in the middle of a noisy party with loud music, flashing lights, and dozens of people talking around you, you suddenly feel deeply alone? Why, paradoxically, the more people surround you, the greater the feeling of isolation can become? This experience is not only yours. There is something deeply revealing in this phenomenon that we collectively experience but rarely discuss. This contradiction invites us to explore an uncomfortable truth about our contemporary society and about the very nature of human consciousness. Why do some people, especially those with a higher degree of self-awareness, often feel the need to escape large crowds? What does this behavior, often labeled as antisocial or introverted, really tell us about the human condition in the 21st century? Is there a hidden wisdom in this distance that our hyper-connected culture and constant exposure try to suppress? For millennia, human beings lived in small groups. Our minds evolved in communities where we knew each person by name, where we shared stories around campfires, where every interaction had context and meaning. A Paleolithic hunter-gatherer interacted closely with perhaps 150 people throughout his entire life. This is the so-called Dunbar number, the theoretical cognitive limit of people with whom we can maintain stable relationships. Our ancestors rarely experienced the sensation of being surrounded by dozens or hundreds of complete strangers. When that happened, it usually meant danger, a hostile encounter with another tribe, a war situation. Our neurobiology was shaped to interpret anonymous crowds as potentially threatening. This ancestral programming remains in our brain like an old software running on modern hardware. The agricultural revolution, about 12,000 years ago, began to drastically change this scenario, creating villages and eventually cities. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the process, producing metropolises where millions of strangers coexist in physical proximity but emotional distance. And finally, the digital revolution created an even deeper paradox. We are simultaneously more connected than ever through our screens and more disconnected in our physical interactions. We may have thousands of online friends whom we have never met in person, while barely knowing the name of the neighbor who lives next door. This radical transformation in our social structure happened in an evolutionary blink of an eye, leaving our internal psychology out of sync with our external environment. When we enter an environment with dozens or hundreds of people, such as a party or a shopping mall, our brain is flooded with a volume of social data that it was never designed to process. Each unfamiliar face, each fragment of conversation captured, each movement in the periphery of our vision demands cognitive resources. Our attention system, developed to track predators on the savannah or identify edible fruits in the forest, becomes overloaded by the excess of irrelevant stimuli. This sensory overload has a real energy cost for our brain, which consumes about 20% of all our body's energy, despite representing only 2% of our body mass. The people we call conscious are often those with nervous systems that are more sensitive to this overload. It's not that they are antisocial, but rather that their perceptual apparatus registers more inputs from the environment and processes this information more deeply. Psychologist Elaine Aron described this phenomenon as the characteristic of the highly sensitive person present in approximately 15 to 20% of the population. These people have an increased ability to notice subtleties, process information more deeply, are more easily stimulated, and have more intense emotional responses. In evolutionary terms, this heightened sensitivity may be a valuable adaptation, allowing greater caution and a richer perception of the environment. But in the artificial context of large human crowds, this same trait can become a disadvantage. When a highly conscious person enters a crowded party, they do not experience just the music and conversations, but also pick up microfacial expressions, subtle changes in tone of voice, unspoken interpersonal tensions, and countless other signals that go unnoticed by many. It is like trying to watch dozens of movies simultaneously, each one telling a complex emotional story. The result is often a feeling of exhaustion and overload that others may not understand. Why are you so tired? We just went to a party. This misunderstanding increases isolation, creating a cycle of social withdrawal. Modern technology has dramatically intensified this problem. Our parties are now not only physical gatherings, but also arenas of digital performance. Every moment is potentially photographed, filmed, shared online, commented on, and eternalized. The constant presence of smartphones means we are never really just here, but always partially there on some invisible digital stage. This additional layer of social complexity demands even more cognitive and emotional resources, especially for those already predisposed to heightened self-awareness. But there is something even deeper happening beyond mere sensory overload or digital performance pressure. The withdrawal of conscious people from hyper-stimulating environments reveals a fundamental truth about the nature of authentic human connection that our society desperately tries to ignore. In our consumer culture, we have been conditioned to believe that more is better in almost every aspect of life. More friends, more connections, more experiences, more stimuli. Social networks reinforce this mentality, rewarding the quantity of connections over their quality. The algorithms that govern these platforms favor content that triggers fast and intense emotional reactions, not deep reflection or genuine bonding. In contrast to this dominant model, people who consistently seek solitude or more limited and deeper social interactions are consciously or unconsciously resisting a powerful cultural narrative. They intuit that true human connection is not scalable. It requires full attention, authentic presence, and mutual vulnerability, qualities that inevitably dilute in mass environments. The more people present in an interaction, the more superficial it tends to be. This is not an elitist criticism of casual socialization, but simply an observation about human cognitive and emotional limits. In pre-industrial societies, people often lived their entire lives in small communities where the depth of relationships compensated for their limited number. A medieval peasant might know only a few dozen people, but knew them intimately through countless interactions over decades. Today, we may interact superficially with thousands of people throughout life, but rarely develop the kind of deep knowledge that was common in earlier eras. We gained breadth, but lost depth. When we observe contemplative cultures around the world, from Buddhist monks to Christian mystics, from Stoic philosophers to yoga practitioners, we find a recurring theme: the value of deliberate solitude as a path to self-knowledge and wisdom. These traditions do not promote pathological isolation, but rather a balance between social engagement and reflective withdrawal. They recognize that certain truths can only be accessed when we temporarily step away from social noise and create space to hear our inner voice. This ancient wisdom is being rediscovered by modern neuroscience, which demonstrates how periods of disengagement are essential for memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creativity. Maybe what we are interpreting as social phobia or introversion is in many cases an intuitive form of psychic self-preservation. People who regularly flee socially dense environments may be protecting their mental integrity and capacity for authentic connection in a world that constantly threatens to fragment our attention and dilute our interactions. Their behavior does not represent a flaw to be corrected, but a healthy adaptation to an increasingly artificial and unbalanced social environment. The real irony is that many of the people who avoid crowded parties and socially stimulating environments are often the most capable of forming deep and meaningful connections in more appropriate contexts. Their withdrawal does not reflect a lack of interest in others, but rather a desire for higher quality interactions. They prefer an intimate conversation with a close friend to dozens of superficial exchanges with acquaintances. They prefer to truly listen to one person rather than partially hear many. This preference is not a social deficit, but a conscious choice to prioritize depth over breadth. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, in what moments of your life do you feel this tension between the cultural imperative of constant socialization and your inner desire for deeper and more meaningful connections? Have you ever felt that peculiar exhaustion after a social event, not just physical, but existential, as if something essential had been drained from you? I know that many of us carry this experience in silence, perhaps for fear of seeming antisocial or inadequate, in a world that celebrates extroversion and perpetual connectivity. But your experiences are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. I feel the need to move away from crowds when. Your voice may help create a space where we can honestly discuss this fundamental tension in our modern social lives. A particularly revealing example of this dynamic can be observed in the behavior of many of the greatest thinkers, artists, and innovators in history. People like Isaac Newton, Emily Dickinson, Marcel Proust, Nikola Tesla, and more recently figures like Bill Gates and J.K. Rowling all demonstrated tendencies towards social withdrawal and a preference for solitude during significant periods of their lives. It is no coincidence that profound contributions to human knowledge often emerge from minds that value deliberate isolation. genuine creativity and original thinking require distance from consensual narratives and prevailing social expectations. It is hard to hear your own voice when you are constantly immersed in the voices of others. Historical perspective helps us understand another aspect of this issue, the relationship between elevated consciousness and sensitivity to social context. In pre-modern societies, the role of the shaman, oracle, or prophet was often assigned to individuals who demonstrated increased sensitivity to social and environmental dynamics. These people perceived patterns and connections that others did not notice, often withdrawing from the community for periods of contemplation before returning with valuable insights. In a certain sense, the highly conscious person who withdraws from socially dense environments is participating in an ancient human tradition of contemplative retreat. When we examine non-Western cultures, we often find a more nuanced understanding of the need for solitude. In Chinese Taoist philosophy, the concept of Wu Wei, or non-action, emphasizes the importance of periods of stillness and disengagement to achieve harmony. In Japanese culture, the term ma describes the empty space between objects, pauses in music, or moments of silence in conversation, all valued as essential elements of aesthetic and social experience. These traditions recognize that meaning does not reside only in presence and action, but also in absence and withdrawal. The pressure to socialize constantly and comfortably in large groups is a relatively recent phenomenon, closely linked to the rise of modern consumerism and the attention economy. Parties, nightclubs, mass concerts, and other high-stimulation social environments are also spaces of intense consumption. Alcohol, food, fashion, entertainment, all are sold more efficiently when people are in states of high social excitement and reduced judgment. It is no coincidence that corporations invest billions in marketing that associates their products with high energy social experiences. The person who regularly chooses not to participate in these environments is also implicitly resisting a powerful mechanism of consumption induction, the tendency to pathologize the desire for solitude or limited social interaction serves specific economic interests. A person satisfied with a quiet afternoon reading a book, walking in nature, or speaking intimately with a close friend consumes less than someone constantly chasing new, stimulating social experiences in commercial environments. The medicalization of traits such as introversion or heightened sensory sensitivity turns natural preferences into conditions to be treated, often with profitable pharmaceutical products. I am not suggesting a deliberate conspiracy, but rather that our economic system naturally favors and amplifies behaviors that generate more consumption. But perhaps the deepest and most disturbing aspect of this issue is how our modern society systematically devalues the very introspection needed to develop self-awareness. From childhood, we are trained to keep our attention externally oriented on the next test, the next game, the next social achievement. Children who show tendencies towards silent contemplation or solitary play are often considered problematic, needing more socialization. Our educational system, designed in the industrial era, rewards conformity and extroverted engagement over deep reflection. Our professional performance evaluations emphasize interpersonal skills and teamwork over contemplative capacity or original insight. The result is a culture that produces externally oriented individuals, highly responsive to social cues and external expectations, but often disconnected from their deepest inner truths. We excel at navigating complex social dynamics, but struggle to answer fundamental questions like, what really matters to me? Or what kind of life do I truly want? This outward orientation creates a particular vulnerability to social and commercial manipulation. When our sense of identity and worth is primarily anchored in external validation, we become ideal consumers, always seeking the next product, experience, or social affirmation that promises to fill the internal void. People who regularly seek solitude and limit their exposure to socially dense environments are, in a sense, performing an act of political resistance, even if they do not conceive of it in those terms. They are affirming the value of inner life in an economy that monetizes external attention. They are prioritizing self-awareness in a culture that encourages constant distraction. They are choosing depth in a system that rewards breadth. By making these choices, they implicitly challenge some of the fundamental premises of our contemporary social organization. The true tragedy is that many highly conscious people internalize the dominant view that pathologizes their natural behavior. They see themselves as socially deficient, anxious, or inadequate because they do not enjoy environments that most people seem to appreciate. They feel guilty for needing time alone after social interactions. They question their worth because their connection needs differ from the model promoted by the dominant culture. This internalization of external judgment causes unnecessary suffering and prevents them from recognizing the inherent wisdom of their natural orientation. The truth is that different neurobiological constitutions require different social environments in order to flourish. Just as some plants thrive in direct sunlight while others require partial shade, some humans develop better in high stimulation social environments while others need more quiet and limited interaction. Neither pattern is inherently superior or healthier. Each represents an adaptive strategy with specific advantages and disadvantages depending on the context. Historically, successful human communities integrated diverse personality types, benefiting from the talents of those oriented toward broad social coordination, as well as the contributions of those inclined toward observation, reflection, and deep specialization. Extroverted hunters worked alongside introspective toolmakers. Socially skillful leaders collaborated with observant healers, each contributing uniquely to collective well-being. This cognitive and temperamental diversity was a critical adaptive advantage for our species. The problem arises when a society begins to disproportionately value one type of orientation over others. When the cultural ideal becomes the always connected networker, always available, always performing, we lose the unique benefits that emerge from more contemplative and introverted minds. We artificially reduce the cognitive diversity that has been central to human creativity and resilience. A revealing parallel can be found in agriculture. For centuries, farmers cultivated diverse crop varieties adapted to specific local conditions. This agricultural biodiversity provided resilience against pests, disease, and climate change. In the 20th century, however, industrial agriculture began favoring monocultures of standardized high-yield varieties. These monocultures are efficient by certain narrow metrics, but extremely vulnerable to unforeseen threats. Likewise, a culture that promotes a narrow model of social behavior and human cognition may seem efficient for certain short-term economic goals, but loses the resilience that comes from cognitive and behavioral diversity. Looking to the future, we can imagine a society that recognizes and values the innate diversity of human temperaments. Such a society would create spaces for high-energy social interaction and spaces for quiet contemplation without implicitly privileging one over the other. It would recognize that different types of contributions emerge from different conditions, and that collective wisdom requires both vibrant social engagement and deep solitary reflection. In such a society, no one would feel inadequate for preferring an intimate conversation with a close friend over a loud party. No one would be diagnosed with a disorder for needing recovery after intense social interaction. No one would be pressured to perform a type of sociability that drains their energy and compromises their authenticity. Instead, each person would be encouraged to discover and honor their own natural pattern of social engagement and solitary contemplation, recognizing that this pattern is not a flaw, but an expression of their singular humanity. This vision is not merely utopian, but pragmatically necessary. As we move into an era of advanced artificial intelligence and widespread automation, uniquely human contributions become increasingly centered on qualities that emerge from our inner life: original creativity, ethical judgment, contemplative wisdom, and authentic emotional connection. Ironically, the very qualities often cultivated by those who regularly withdraw from social tumult are the ones that may become most valuable in our collective future. Perhaps we should therefore reconsider our understanding of elevated consciousness and the social behavior associated with it. What if avoiding large crowds is not a deficit to be corrected or an anxiety to be overcome, but an intelligent adaptive strategy for certain minds in certain contexts? What if the person who consistently prefers more limited and deeper interactions is intuitively protecting a valuable cognitive and emotional capacity, increasingly rare in our hyper-connected world? This does not mean romanticizing extreme isolation or pathological social withdrawal, which can certainly indicate real suffering. But it suggests that we should be much more cautious about pathologizing preferences for limited socialization, especially when these arise naturally and do not cause significant suffering to the person. The line between legitimate mental disorder and simple neurological diversity is often determined more by arbitrary cultural norms than by objective science. The real challenge, both individually and collectively, is to develop discernment about which forms and quantities of social interaction genuinely nourish us, energize us, and expand our awareness versus which drain us, fragment us, and reduce our presence. This discernment requires honest self-reflection and a willingness to question prevailing social expectations. It requires courage to set boundaries that protect our mental and emotional integrity in a world that constantly seeks to capture and monetize our attention. If you often find yourself overwhelmed in socially dense environments, if you regularly need time alone to process experiences and regain balance, if your most meaningful interactions typically happen in intimate conversations rather than large social events, know that these patterns do not reflect any fundamental deficiency. They are valid expressions of a natural variation in human experience with deep roots in our biology, psychology, and even ancient spiritual traditions. Your desire for depth over breadth, for quality over quantity in human connections is not something to be overcome, but a wisdom to be honored. In fact, as our society becomes more saturated with information, more dominated by technology-mediated interactions, and more oriented toward constant external performance, the ability to withdraw deliberately, to stay in touch with one's inner voice, and to cultivate full presence in direct human interactions becomes not just a personal preference, but an act of preserving one's own humanity. If these reflections touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps hadn't found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space of dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. As we move forward into the digital age, with its dazzling promises and subtle dangers, we will increasingly need spaces where we can honestly explore the complexity of being human in this unique historical moment. Spaces where not everything needs to be optimized, monetized, or performed for an audience. Spaces that honor both our need for connection and our need for contemplation. Spaces that recognize that true wisdom emerges not only from constant engagement with the external world, but also from the attentive stillness that allows us to hear the whispers of our own consciousness. Perhaps, in the end, the conscious person who regularly steps away from crowds and seeks more limited and deeper interactions is not fleeing reality, but moving toward a more authentic one. A reality not defined primarily by external approval or conformity with social expectations, but by fidelity to one's essential nature and to the kinds of connection that truly nourish the soul. In this sense, their withdrawal does not represent a failure to adapt to the modern world, but a successful adaptation that preserves what is most valuable in the human experience. even when external conditions do not naturally favor it, this may be, after all, the hidden truth revealed by the behavior of those who consistently avoid socially dense environments, that genuine human consciousness in all its depth and subtlety requires specific conditions to flourish. That our minds are not infinitely adaptable machines, capable of thriving in any environment, but delicate ecologies that depend on careful balances between stimulation and reflection, connection and contemplation, engagement and withdrawal. And that honoring these balances, even when it means swimming against the dominant cultural current, is not just a matter of personal preference, but of existential integrity. I go to therapy every week. I have a weekly session. People can wonder, why do people need to go to therapy? The subject matter in therapy is myself. Who knows myself better than me? Why do I need to go to some stranger to learn about myself? This is ridiculous. But it's not. Because yes, I know more about myself than any other person perhaps, but there are so many things I don't want to know about myself. I have access to all the data, to the memories, to the daily events, but I reject some things I really like to know about myself, but the more painful, the darker episodes in my life, the more painful things I do in the present, it's very difficult for a person to acknowledge that about oneself. If you're in a relationship and there is a problem in a relationship, you ask and people would say, I'm perfect. It's the other person who is causing all the problem. If only the other person changed a little, behaved differently, everything would be perfect. And you ask the other person, they would say exactly the same thing. I'm perfect. It's my husband, it's my wife that is causing all the problem in our household. So this is why I need to go to therapy, to get professional help, to realize some very deep truths about yourself that are too difficult or too painful to acknowledge. History is like therapy for entire civilizations or for the whole of humankind. Also, entire nations often don't want to acknowledge dark episodes in their past or dark things they are doing right now. Entire civilizations, the same. You ask, and almost every nation, almost every country would say, we are perfect. All the problems are because of the other nations. All the problems are because of the other civilizations, of the other cultures. I think the responsible job of historians to simply help people understand better the big processes and the deep sources of the problems in the world. And this is a big responsibility. The thing is that not in a dictatorship, in a democracy, newspapers and other news outlets are liable for their decisions. Like if the editor of the New York Times decides to publish some conspiracy theory or fake news at the front page of the New York Times, he cannot hide or she cannot hide behind the argument, but free speech, there are some people who believe it's true, so I put it on the front page of the New York Times. No, your job as editor is not just to put something random there or something that would please people. Your job is to fact check and to take responsibility for these decisions and to make sure that if you publish something on the front page of the New York Times, you better be sure that this is accurate and this is responsible. And if you don't know how to do it, then you're in the wrong job.
Hi, everybody. So I'm very excited to be back here. Last time I was here, I was talking about my own book with Sam Altman, who did an excellent job, a little frightening how good he was as an interviewer for my book. But I'm very excited. I've interviewed Yuval, I think several times. But I'm super excited that he wrote a book about AI, really. But it's actually about the history of information, because he's a historian by trade. And so I'm super excited to talk about that. I'm thrilled you're all here. You missed the vice presidential debate. It's probably a good thing. This is much more interesting. And we won't be talking about eating dogs, so that's good. We're already way ahead. And I'm very excited. He needs no introduction. What an amazing man, what an amazing author. And this book is sure to be another bestseller. Yuval, come out, Yuval Harari. Great. So we have a lot of questions, and then we'll get to questions from the audience at the end. We can't see you very well right now, so apologies if I don't, but we will bring up the lights when you ask questions. But I've got a bunch of them. This is actually going to be put on with Kara Swisher on the podcast, it should be really interesting and a great discussion. So welcome to City Arts and Lectures. It's great to see you again, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's really good to be here with you.
So we're here to talk about your latest book, Nexus, a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI. It's not brief. It's quite a large and long book.
From the Stone Age to AI in 400 pages, it's quite brief.
Oh, all right. Okay, fine. Okay, all right. Okay, if you say so. Your first bestseller, Sapiens, obviously, A Brief History of Humankind. I like to use brief all the time. Came out in 2011. And honestly, these books could kill a small dog, speaking of dogs. And then you wrote Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow in 2015. Yeah. And again, despite the titles are not so brief. So let's talk about what you were trying to do with Nexus and how it relates to these other books that you wrote and why you decided to do this. And then we're going to get into history first.
So, it picks up where I left off with Sapiens and with Homo Deus. Mm-hmm. The two main questions at the basis of the book is, first of all, if humans are so smart, why are we so stupid? Mm-hmm. We've managed to take over this planet, to reach the moon, to split the atom, to decipher DNA, and here we are on the verge of destroying ourselves and much of the ecological system with us in several different ways. Could be ecological collapse, could be nuclear war, could be the rise of AI. Mm-hmm. So what's wrong with us? Mm-hmm. And this is a question that has bothered people throughout history. And you have a lot of answers in mythologies and theologies that tells us that there is something wrong with us. Mm-hmm. There is something wrong with human nature. Mm-hmm. And Nexus takes a different view. The problem is not in our nature. The problem is in our information. Mm-hmm. If you give good people bad information, they will make bad decisions.
Right.
And self-destructive decisions. And then the book goes on to explore the long-term history of information. Why isn't information getting better? Mm-hmm. You would have expected that correct. Over thousands of years, our information will get better, and it really doesn't. Large-scale modern societies are as susceptible to mass delusion and really insanity, like mass insanity, as Stone Age tribes. If you think about the 20th century with Stalinism and Nazism, far more powerful, of course, than Stone Age tribes, a lot more sophisticated information technology, but still can be extremely delusional. And when you look at the world today, we have the most sophisticated information technology in history, and people are unable to hold a rational conversation anymore.
There's a technology term for that, which is very technical, which is garbage in, garbage out, right? And I think it explains quite a bit of it in a really kind of very easy, simple way. But the point you're making is this is historical.